Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining our webinar today. We started the recording. We'll let everybody have a chance to get in, and we'll get started here in about a minute. All right, we're at 2:01. Thank you for joining us today. If you would take a moment, and if you could put in the chat where you're from and where you're joining us from today, that'll just let us know who's joining us. Again, thank you for taking the time to join us for our introduction to high impact tutoring. We'll introduce our guest today. We're fortunate to have our guests come and share some updated information and research on the latest and greatest for high impact tutoring. And again, thank you for joining us. My name is Colby Self. I'm the director of Texas Tutoring Supports for the Texas Education Agency. And we have Leah Groom-Thomas. And Leah, I'll let you introduce yourself today.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me today. As Colby mentioned, my name is Leah Groom-Thomas. I am a researcher for the National Student Support Accelerator out of Stanford. I'm excited to be discussing this with you today and to share what we currently know about high impact tutoring and what we are underway, what we are learning and hope to learn in the future.
All right. Well, I see the chat's not functioning. I'll work on that here in a second, or maybe Alicia can help with that. As you have questions as we go along, the Q&A function should be available if you want to drop those questions in the chat, or not the chat, in the Q&A. We'll try to get to those as we progress through the presentation here today. High impact tutoring, tutoring in general, has been in Texas for about 3 years. We did some initial webinars when we kicked this off under House Bill 4545. We had some grant programs. Many of you may have participated in our T-class grants, Decision 6, which just wrapped up, promoted high impact tutoring. Well, we thought it'd be a great time to reboot, update the research, update the best practices. And so we're fortunate to have Leah here today to share some of the latest and greatest research and some of the best practices as you go along your journey. And so I'm going to turn it over to Leah now and let her present the information. Again, if you have questions, I see Rhonda's able to post a question in the Q&A, so we know that's working. We'll monitor that. As we come across the links in the presentation, we'll post those as well so you can navigate to the great resources provided. And this presentation will also be posted after we're done today, along with the video, on our accelerated instruction webpage. We hope to have that posted by the end of this week. So without further ado, Leah, I'll kick us off here and navigate the slides for you.
Great. Thanks so much, Colby. So before I begin, just very quickly, I want to go over what we do at the NSSA for those of you who are unfamiliar. So we help districts and states to more easily adopt high impact tutoring with quality. So we envision a time where every student in need has access to an effective tutor who champions and ensures their learning and success. So our goal in order to reach this vision isn't by providing the tutoring ourselves, but supporting states and districts and schools to adopt and grow high impact tutoring programs. We do this through 3 strands of work. So first, we facilitate implementation by providing tools and strategic advising. Second, we work together to catalyze the field of tutoring through communities of practice and through new knowledge from research. And third, we engage and activate stakeholders to share our work broadly. So during our time together today, I encourage you to consider the ways that your district or school might be able to adopt some of the practices needed for effective high impact tutoring. If you have questions, please drop them in the chat and our wonderful TEA team will field them, and we'll also have time at the end for Q&A. And after today, I really hope to leave you with answers to the following questions. What makes tutoring effective? What are we learning from ongoing research? How are states supporting tutoring? And what do we hope to learn next? And Colby, you can go ahead and change the slide. We know that the pandemic dramatically reduced learning. So just providing a little bit of context here before we dive in. But even though we know that the pandemic created a greater need for this, it's not necessarily a new challenge. K-12 students who fall behind in school are often unable to catch up, and we've known this for a long time. But by May of 2021, as a result of COVID, students in the US were on average 4 months behind where they likely would have been in reading and 5 months behind where they would likely have been in math. And most recently, we've seen this impact in our national data as well. Many of you are probably familiar with the National Assessment of Education Progress, where we assess fourth and eighth grade students every few years in math and reading, and we've done this for decades. And schools made progress with students in math since the turn of the century, but the pandemic really wiped out the majority of those gains in both fourth and eighth grades, really taking us back to where the average scores were in 2003. And these average changes really mask even bigger drops for some groups. So not only did the pandemic negatively affect learning, the pandemic was also not experienced equally. So students who started out the lowest achieving ended up far behind where they likely would have been without the pandemic, while those who were initially higher achieving students experienced much less loss, and in many cases, no loss relative to prior years. So it's clear that bringing our students back to these pre-pandemic levels has and will continue to require significant effort. So that raises the question of how to support students who were hit the hardest by the pandemic, as well as those who are already not learning as much as they could have, and accelerate their learning. Next slide. And there's a large body of evidence that supports tutoring. Rarely in research do we have so much evidence that's pointing to the promise of a specific approach. Researchers have performed over 150 studies. This graph is representing randomized control trials. So these are systematic studies of program effects that do a really nice job of isolating the true effect of the program on student learning. And these studies time and time again show that positive treatment effects of tutoring across grade levels and subject areas as a result of intensive relationship-based individualized instruction, which we call high impact tutoring. And with these effects, most cases, they're ranging in a half a year to more than a year of learning over one academic year of tutoring. And this is for students across grade levels in both reading and math. And importantly, these results are often based on studies of students who are far behind grade level. So the students that we know we really need to reach. Okay, you can change the slide. Tutoring turns out to be really effective, a really effective way to accelerate learning for those, especially those with substantial unfinished learning. And this makes it particularly well suited as an intervention in the wake of COVID. This is really the only way that we know of currently to accelerate individual students' learning. It's already the intervention of choice. Hearing about tutoring is not new. This may be new for you today to hear about high dosage tutoring or high impact tutoring, but the US has already invested $47 billion back from 2020. We also know that the logic behind high impact tutoring is that we're targeting students in need and building close relationships. So really kind of thinking of the whole child as opposed to or I shouldn't say as opposed to, but in comparison to some other academic interventions. There are also some potential spillover effects that benefit tutors, such as having community volunteers or having high school students that can mentor younger students in the community and really kind of reflect the population they're serving, and even kind of create additional teacher pipelines for students such as those in teacher prep programs at higher ed institutions. So there are a lot of benefits to tutoring is the point here, above and beyond just the academic growth we're seeing in students who receive it. Next slide. However, as we know, and similar to other interventions, people define tutoring in many ways, and not all of these approaches are as effective. And one example of this is under the No Child Left Behind Act, parents whose children were in schools failing to meet adequate yearly progress for 2 or more years were able to sign their children up for tutoring outside of school. And This, in theory, may sound like a good idea, but it was not particularly effective or equitable. There were few students who participated. It was around 23% of eligible students. And of those, the average impact was nearly zero. So this was because there were programs that varied widely and there was little focus on quality. And although we weren't seeing the impacts that we would have liked from this legislation, NCLB tutoring demonstrated some positive outcomes in places that had things like more structured tutoring sessions and stronger coordination with schools. And so there are features that we know were critical from this time that really led and bolstered the efficacy of tutoring programs. Next slide. So we've taken all of these elements of programs from NCLB findings, those 150 RCT studies and across 8 meta-analyses that I just mentioned. We've taken all of that information and put it into a framework for high impact tutoring that really highlights 7 specific elements that we at the NSSA believe is critical for high impact tutoring programs to be most efficacious. And you don't need to worry about taking notes on this. Again, as Colby said, this will be posted for your reference at any time. And I'm also going to dive into each one of these 7 elements in more detail now. Next slide. So the first 3 that I would like to talk about, equity, safety, and cohesion, are really what we consider our 3 foundational elements. Equity means ensuring students who need it most have access, and it means that tutors lead sessions with equity at the center of their instruction. The program must also ensure, of course, that students and their information are safe and protected. There's no surprise there. In terms of cohesion, effective programs have strong leaders who make sure all of the program's elements and internal systems work together cohesively, all towards the program goals. And so these 3 foundational elements support the next 4 model-specific elements that I'm going to discuss. Next slide. The first one is the tutor. This is very important, also not surprising. The great news is that that a wide range of people can actually become an effective high-impact tutor. While certified teachers have certainly proven to be particularly effective tutors, paraprofessionals, college students, and others can also be very effective as well. Effective programs tend to place a high priority on developing not just the tutor, but the tutor-student relationship. And this requires having a consistent tutor who not only has command of the appropriate content knowledge, but just as importantly, is skilled at engaging students and developing positive relationships. We really believe that the relationship piece is key on consistent attendance and building rapport with students so they have a trust built with the consistent tutor that they are engaging with. So overall, high-impact tutoring programs must have strong tutors who have received initial training and have ongoing coaching and evaluation. This is what we see time and time again to be the most helpful when finding tutors for these programs.
Well, yeah,
Next
I think we
Yes.
got sync on slides. If you'll check the
Okay.
slides, just make sure. I think we got out of sync.
Oh, yeah. So we should be on the
Slide.
one after tutor.
Okay.
Okay, so I believe it's instruction. There we go.
I think that's my fault. I must have double clicked. I apologize for that. So
No worries. Thank you for stopping me. That way we didn't continue.
okay, just double check.
Okay, that's fine. So the next model specific element is instruction, and the high impact tutoring models require special attention to both the amount of instruction and the instructional materials that are used. So evidence shows us that in order to be high impact, students need to see their tutors at least 3 times per week for at least a semester, or better yet, a full school year. And the quality of instruction is, of course, important as well. As we saw what came out of NCLB, this was one of the main issues with the lack of significance in student outcomes, or the lack of, kind of positive gains, was the quality of instruction. So most tutors need quality instructional materials. And in the best case scenarios of what we've seen across districts is the school using high quality materials that the tutors can build off of. So this could be schools' curricular materials. This could be from the individual high impact tutoring program that supplement classroom materials with other high quality instructional materials, all of which is aligned with state standards. That's really important. And for some tutoring, I'm going to talk about this a little bit later, but in some tutoring providers that we have seen to have very effective outcomes, they have kind of these they align all of their instruction with state standards, and then they tailor it to the district based on what the specific district needs are. Okay, next slide, which should be learning integration. So in terms of learning integration, programs that are embedded in the school day or are directly before and after school are particularly effective. This can be tricky as it is important not to replace core instruction. And it also is tricky because in a lot of the implementation models we've seen up to this point, even if the teacher isn't the tutor, and in many cases they aren't the tutor, it still requires and some level of demand from the teacher to help manage the sessions, whether they be virtual and the teacher helping manage the technology, or kind of assisting the tutor if they're there in person for a pull-out model. There still is a demand on the teacher. And so that is something that is very important to communicate and to support at both the district and school level. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. This integration with the school is important because these programs have higher attendance, and importantly for equity, they're able to reach the students who need the tutoring most. It's not that there is magic that necessarily happens during the hours of the school day, but what we have found in the studies that we have conducted, what we have found is that because accessibility is best during the school day. If you think about the students that don't have to worry about transportation, don't have to worry about caregiver dropping off and picking up. They're already there during the school day, and so tapping in during that time seems to be the best. Integration with the classroom is also beneficial as the tutor can learn about the student from the teacher and focus the lesson on aligned instruction. However, I do want to mention that the most important part of integration is making sure that the students who need it most are the ones who get it. And so really coordinating with schools and teachers to make sure to learn about their selection criteria and really thinking about developing this program for yourself. That's one of the first recommendations I would have, is figuring out program focus and who it's going to serve, who your students are going to be, and your selection criteria for going about that. Okay, the next slide should be data use. So finally, the last one that I would like to talk about is data. High impact tutoring programs use data to understand students' learning needs and to track their progress. And these data can come from the school or from the teacher, or the tutoring program can do their own formative assessments to track progress. Anyone design tutoring sessions to meet the needs of individual students, but regardless of the source of the data, there's something more important than that. It's the way that the data are used to tailor instruction for the students. So just as a teacher in the classroom is taking formative and summative assessments and utilizing that data to inform their instruction to individualize to the needs of the student, high impact tutoring needs to do the same thing. So that is one of the key benefits of tutoring, is that it can address each student's specific needs, and tutors need to use data to understand these needs. Okay, next slide. We have found that it is helpful not only to describe the elements of high impact tutoring, but also to hone in on what it is and what it isn't. And this was really helpful for me when I was starting out with this work, because there are so many other interventions that we know are helpful for students depending on what their needs are. And so thinking about this differently than homework help and what we think of when we think of classic tutoring, this is really helpful in that regard. So high impact tutoring is not homework help. It is consistent instruction that develops a strong relationship between the student and the tutor that increases the well-being as well as the content-specific learning of the student. It is always with a consistent tutor as much as it can be, not a different tutor each session. We believe this for a few reasons. One is because this consistency is important in order for tutoring to be relationship focused, not just focused on question resolution. And also, this really allows students to kind of build rapport and trust. So above and beyond just the relationship, what we have seen is that oftentimes students will confide in tutors about, challenging things that are going on in their life. And so it's really kind of tapping into SEL in addition to academic learning. And we're still hoping to learn more about that aspect of it, but it all kind of comes down to having a consistent tutor that a student can depend on. Sessions are built around students' needs and informed by data on where their need is. It's not just reliant on the students to tell the tutor what they need help with. So it's not just, I'm failing math, it's the tutor actually taking assessment and learning what aspects and areas of math they need to start in, aligning it with instruction and making sure the student, meeting the needs of the student and not asking the student what they need help with. High impact tutoring is also focused on acceleration so that students can build the specific skills that they need for their grade level work. It's not focused on remediation. And importantly, it's intensive with regular meetings at least 3 times a week. And lastly, and this is key, it is accessible to all students in need. I feel like a broken record. I know I've said that a lot of times so far, but that really is instrumental, that it's accessible to all students in need. And as a result, it doesn't rely on parents to take it up or to pay for the tutoring or worry about pickup, drop off, transportation, or other barriers that we might see with other supplemental programs. And at this time, I know that our TEA team is going to drop in the chat our out of school time guide. So I know that I'm talking about it needs to be embedded in the school day and accessible to all eligible students. But right before or after school may also work given, kind of your district capacity and the model that you have set up. An important takeaway here is that I mentioned it's not that the magic happens during the hours of 8 to 3 during the school day, but we do see better attendance during school when these programs are happening during the school because students are more likely to participate, right? So we have heard, with that being said, we have heard from some of our partners that it doesn't always have to be during the school day as long as it isn't a new thing. So if you are not already engaged in a high impact tutoring program that's happening at your school, and your students are already familiar with it or enrolled and attending on a regular basis, it probably will be more challenging to implement. When we have seen out of school time programs be more successful, it's when high impact tutoring is already something that exists at the school or at the district.
We have a question in
Okay.
the Q&A, and I can kind of speak to this as well. When it says 3 times a week, is there a time recommendation for those times? I think you were kind of alluding to that. It's more about having that protected in the schedule and a consistent
Correct.
time. And is that what you're alluding to?
Yeah, so a lot of the programs range. Are you talking about the time of session, like 30 to 45 minutes?
Yeah, I think that's what it
Happen?
is. If that's not the question, they could repost it, but it's just, 3 times a week or having that daily schedule, just protected time.
Yeah.
That's part of the normal rotation or normal schedule within the day. It's not this one-off time that occurs randomly or rarely that has to be worked in and sometimes gets taken away for various assemblies or other events that are
Right.
often intruding upon it. It's not consistent. And I think that's where a lot of LEAs or a lot of schools get in trouble. It's not a protected time that everybody knows where they go, what they do, especially if you're scheduling, trying to schedule those consistent tutors and build those relationships as well.
That's exactly right, Colby.
When I was an elementary principal, we this was well before the concept of high impact tutoring. I was fully aware of it. We had what I need time. So every grade level had what I need time. I would conceptualize that time in the schedule as a protected time where every grade level could have this built in, and it would be leveraged where students knew where they would go, who they're working with, the particular content that they would use, and what they were working on for a particular day. And so that's something that I've shared with particular districts that would call me working on schedules, and that's been a challenge, especially for secondary. Secondary has different challenges from elementary, so thinking of that is seems to be a battle in the beginning as they're setting up high impact tutoring. But your OST guide has some resources or examples people can leverage in thinking through that process. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
It's good.
Okay, next slide. So I was also asked to not just kind of do an intro to high impact tutoring, but really kind of talk about the landscape of tutoring at state and national level. So what we currently know right now, and what I believe is very exciting, is that 46% of public schools utilize high impact tutoring. Some states have mandated statewide tutoring through legislative efforts, such as your very own Texas. Almost all districts who are utilizing high impact tutoring are using academic performance as a criterion for participating in it. And most are concerned with culturally responsive pedagogy and links to the community, which is really exciting because, again, that touches on a lot of different aspects of high impact tutoring that we know to be critical for success. However, attendance issues in after school, often opt-in models do hinder equity. Attendance is an issue that we are continuing to see with respect to barriers to implementation as well as staffing. And just kind of getting this off the ground and running is also something we're really seeing challenges with. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about implementation challenges and ways that you can navigate those in a few slides. Many states are allocating dollars to districts or higher ed institutions or tutoring providers to really fund budgets and require instruction to be aligned with key characteristics of high impact tutoring. We are seeing this in Tennessee. Recently, I say recently, gosh, it's probably been a year and a half ago now. The state of Colorado is an example. Above and beyond the ESSER dollars that districts were using to fund these programs, the state came out with a high impact tutoring grant that districts could apply for that were funds allocated specifically for a high impact tutoring program. So districts could utilize those funds to scale their programs without taking away from other supplemental programs or interventions that they believed were also really useful for their students. Some states are focusing on building infrastructure needed to sustain tutoring for the long term, and we're going to talk a little bit about funding post ESSER. I know that that's a topic right now that a lot of people have questions about. Some states are providing portfolios of vetted tutoring providers to districts. We're seeing this in DC, or training districts on how to successfully design and implement tutoring programs. And we're seeing this across several states that we're working with. Next slide. So the previous slide was states that are currently engaged in high impact tutoring. This is highlighting states that provide funding for tutoring that's not necessarily aligned with HIT standards. And these could include opt-in, opt-out, school options. So that's just something to keep in mind. There is still tutoring happening and it's being funded. It just doesn't necessarily align with our HIT standards. Next slide. So I want to talk about state level trends, and then we'll kind of zoom out and talk about national trends that we're seeing currently. So right now there are 16 states that have passed or are working to pass tutor related policies. 40 states provide funding for tutoring programs, but only 26 of those require the programs to be aligned with high impact standards. That's what you just saw. And 11 states are partnering with higher ed institutions to help facilitate tutoring policy implementation, which has been really key in because as a result of tight labor markets and understaffing, it's been really helpful to building tutor supply to utilize college students. 12 states provide guidance to help districts implement tutoring programs. We have found that this is really helpful with building out plans from the start. Having Having these provisions by the state has helped guide the districts, which has been key for things like your first year, your pilot year launch. And then last but not least, 15 states provide tutor recruiting and training resources like that tutoring and learning integration elements, as well as the instruction elements of high impact tutoring. This really taps into all three of those because we know that those resources are so critical, as well as ongoing coaching support for the tutors. And our TEA team is going to link our current state policy snapshot that we've done at the NSSA. And as a reminder, these are trends, right? So these trends reflect a moment in time, and they really continue to evolve as additional evidence informs policy and as the funding ebb and flows. So we're currently updating this state policy snapshot. The one that you're going to see in the link is from last year, and we're currently updating it for 2024 and should have this out the beginning of 2025. Right now in Texas, we know there's recently been new legislation. I know that Colby's going to talk more about House Bill 1416, I believe, in a subsequent webinar. But we do know that there are districts in Texas, such as Ector County, that are doing high impact tutoring programs with external providers such as FEV and Air Tutors, and they are engaged in something that's called outcomes-based contracting, where these types of tutoring contracts actually include a portion of the payment contingent to the tutor provider based on the attainment of agreed upon success metrics set forth by the school district. And so outcomes-based contracts is something that we are starting to hear more and more about as districts adopt these high-impact tutoring initiatives. So I think that that's something that maybe to keep on your radar. This is one way to kind of, I don't want to say convince your board, but we do see that districts do have a lot of board buy-in and district level buy-in when these contracts are a part of negotiations, because it really kind of gets high-impact tutoring key characteristics explicitly laid out in the contracts from the start, and also basically says if we're not meeting these benchmarks, or if we're not seeing these agreed upon success metrics, success outcomes for students, that docks the pay for the vendor. So it's really kind of you're paying for what you get. Next slide. So zooming out, thinking about what this looks like on a national level across all states, I already mentioned 46% of public schools are offering high impact tutoring. This has increased from 37% that we saw at the end of 2022. 33% of schools who are currently offering it reported that the number of students who needed high impact tutoring increased over the course of the year. And 52% reported that programs were deemed extremely effective. So this is basically showing that districts believe, schools believe that they're building broad belief and buy-in in the approach, in the strategy, in the intervention, which is key for this continuing for long-term success. 51% of public schools that did not offer high impact tutoring this year reported that finding staff to support it was a reason why it was not implemented. And this is not surprising. Teachers are stretched thin. We think about homegrown in-house programs and how difficult it is to add more to existing staff plate. Capacity is another thing that we see. You may have 3 different things going on your plate, and then if you're asked to integrate tutoring above and beyond that, it just can push people over the edge. So really thinking about being strategic and creative about tutor pipeline, staffing shortages, ways to build internal capacity at the district to support this, but then also contract out as needed, are all really key design things to think about from the beginning before you launch your program. Next slide. So we've also studied the national landscape of implementation over the past couple of years. So we looked at district-led high-impact tutoring initiatives to really learn more about, okay, what is helping facilitate tutoring, what's hindering progress on the ground. And so I'm going to share some findings with you from over 100 semi-structured interviews with everyone from district officials down to the individual teachers and tutors in the classrooms. And these results are from 10 geographically diverse districts across the country. And time again, our findings showed that there were three overarching perceptions about what is helping facilitate implementation of high impact tutoring. The first one, financial supports. I'm sure this is unsurprising. Obviously, ESSER, the influx of federal dollars was huge in terms of opportunity for providing programming to more students than ever before, and especially thinking about doing it at an individual level. There was also perceived increased flexibility over other existing school funds that could be utilized for other interventions or supplemental programs that schools didn't want to get rid of in place of tutoring, to replace with tutoring, but to still also be able to provide those as an add-on in addition to high impact tutoring. And as I mentioned, we're going to talk a little bit more about funding beyond ESSER in a minute. Another thing that helps with implementation is having district level buy-in. So many people that we spoke to said that having a broad administrative belief in tutoring as a promising practice for accelerating student learning was key. This helped with developing structures to enable implementation. So thinking about, there were some districts that we know created new internal departments that were devoted solely to high impact tutoring. If they couldn't do that, they still had a new initiative in the district to really help minimize disruption to existing school schedules. So as Colby mentioned, having a designated intervention block is one way that you can, as a district leader, really kind of set the precedent for what your expectation is, and that you are really committed to integrating high impact tutoring into existing school schedules. And then something else to consider is, we definitely recommend starting small if you can. I know that, we're out of time on ESSER funding. So, things are a little bit more difficult in terms of piloting for a first year and then ramping up from there. But we found that districts were most successful when they could incorporate their learnings from their pilot year into year one. So not really building the cart as you go, but kind of figuring out the kinks and troubleshooting, so things were a little bit more seamless as you begin to scale. The last thing that we've been hearing really facilitates implementation is curricular alignment and data support. So thinking about curricular content and mapping this on with state standards, it's motivating for students to see growth from progress monitoring, and this also helps with with future instruction when you're engaging students and making sure you're really meeting them where they need it most. And then also engaging in continuous improvement meetings. So what I mean by this is, if you're hiring out, whether you're hiring out an external tutor provider or you have an in-house program, utilizing data and talking about it regularly, with people in the district really kind of, again, it solidifies not only that buy-in from the beginning, but that this is something that can be supportive long-term, as long as, people continue to believe that it is a strategy that can help students accelerate their learning. Next slide. We've also heard three overarching perceptions about what really hinders implementation of these programs. And so in thinking about, regardless of where you are in the process, if you are just thinking about whether or not this might be something that can meet the needs of the students in your district, or you are in the throes of designing a program, putting out an RFP, whatever it may be, these are some challenges that I do just want you to think about. And something that we can also discuss at the end of today is maybe some other challenges that you've been experiencing and ways that you may be able to strategize and navigate that in the future. But one thing that we have been hearing from districts is that infrastructure and school level buy-in is a challenge. So policies around background checks and procurement, doing hiring and staffing at this magnitude, it's not something that schools and districts are used to doing. And so it creates long delays for rollout, it pushes timelines back, and it therefore is harder to maintain that buy-in for teachers and school leaders, because if you have a designated intervention block, but no intervention happening, teachers are going to figure out another way to utilize that time, right? And so thinking about how you can consider that in your plans and really kind of figure out a way to navigate that and troubleshoot earlier on. That way you don't have too long of delay. There's also been mention of inadequate communication. And what I mean by that is in districts where we've seen a broad belief at the district level, it could be a capacity issue, it could be a communication issue, but we're not quite seeing that messaging, that positive messaging around tutoring trickle down to schools and to students. And we believe that this may have led to lower school level buy-in and in some cases even attendance for students. If they don't know why they're attending tutoring, tutoring can have a negative connotation to it. So if it's not around accelerating and growth, but about remediation, then a lot of times that can be shameful for students. So just thinking about the messaging is even something, and communicating that clearly is something that we believe is really important. On-site challenges with implementation is, I mean, I think that this kind of goes without saying, but people are doing a lot of things. We're asking a lot of teachers and a lot of school leaders and a lot of district leaders. And so things like insufficient capacity in schools is of course a challenge. Limited school staff to offer technical support. I mentioned, you know, a lot of times we have heard districts say, but this may not take a lot from our teachers. Well, they may not be the ones who are actually doing the tutoring themselves, but if there are technical issues during a virtual program like cameras or microphones not functioning, the teachers are the ones that have to manage that. So a lot of times we hear teachers believe that it's taking away from their instructional time. And so that's something that you really want to think about how you are going to troubleshoot if and when that occurs to make sure that teachers feel supported, and make sure that this is something that they want to continue for the long term with their students who need it. And last, student absences and dosage. Chronic absenteeism is, something that we are seeing nationwide right now. And I think that above and beyond that, competing demands on student schedules, testing, alternative services, and interventions are all considerations that really need to go in from your plans at the very beginning when you are building out the infrastructure for your high impact tutoring program. You also have to consider if you would like to do a virtual program versus an in-person one. Think about how much easier it might be for students to, especially thinking older students, high schoolers, where they're responsible for their own schedules. It's easier to forget or miss a virtual session. And then we get to the issue of makeup sessions or following up with students to make sure they attended. If you have an in-person tutor, they can be there checking in on the student. It's a lot harder to do from a remote location in a virtual setting. So I'm not saying not to do virtual programs, but those are just some things to think about if those are the types of platforms that are going to best serve the needs of the students in your district. Okay, next slide. So, how do we fund these programs in a post-ESSER world? This is something that we at the NSSA have been thinking a lot about. But with that being said, there's still a lot to learn. So I know the TEA team is going to drop two resources for you in the chat right now. The first one is a funding brief that really focuses on federal grant programs, leveraging existing systems such as MTSS. Oh, and also an MTSS brief that will talk more about how to integrate high impact tutoring into tiered interventions that are already existing in schools. And the funding brief will also talk about cost-effective resources. So how to utilize, how to increase tutor supply with it being most cost-effective. So for example, general education paraprofessionals and college students are two really large pools that can be tapped to provide tutoring. And I just would like to note that these are general ed paraprofessionals. So they may already be on the Title I budget or another budget in the school, And they still have costs associated with them being tutors, but you could shift their use for whatever they're doing now to tutoring. So just I think it's really kind of you got to be creative to figure out how this is going to work. And unfortunately, there isn't a set formula for how to do this, right? I think it is really going to be it's going to be varied across state, district, and school contexts, and it's going to take us some time to figure out what is going to be the best way to move forward. But the funding brief should provide some hands-on, good examples of how you can incorporate and fund programs post ESSER. And one of the ways is leveraging existing systems, and the MTSS brief is also dropped in the chat for you. One thing that I would love to gauge from the audience at this time is, for our own knowledge, we're asking everybody how, we're asking everyone, how are you funding your programs? And so something I would really kind of push the audience to think about and respond in the chat if you'd like. We could also talk about this when I wrap up. But what are you currently using or planning to use as a funding source for your HIT program? And if we could just field any of those responses, that would be awesome, and I would love to talk about them. Okay, I see ESSER 3 liquidation funds. Thank you for those of you who's responding. And if you don't have anything in mind yet, that's okay. It's just something that you, of course, need to think about sooner rather than later. Grants, I would love to know more about what grants, if they're district level or state level. Okay, and as people continue to respond, let's go ahead and move on to the next slide. I'm just keeping an eye on time here. Okay, so now where are we with the research? We're learning more. We know that experience and research tells us how we implement tutoring is critical for student learning. There are policy guardrails and quality standards and fidelity of implementation that are necessary, but insufficient on their own, right? To make sure that these tutoring programs are designed and implemented in ways that are effective for students. And so one thing that I want you to really think about is, and I think acknowledge, right? That I'm acknowledging this right now, that implementation of these programs is not easy. It's complex and it's difficult, and it requires different levels of autonomy in order for it to work within these district contexts. So even just thinking about launching a program, not even implementing it to scale, requires significant infrastructure and processes. So that's why we really encourage those that we partner with to start small, troubleshoot, work out the kinks, take good documentation, use data to inform your decisions, and then really take those learnings into year two. That is time and time again what we have seen to be the most beneficial. And the districts who do succeed are the ones who start small. Next slide. So the great news is that we are continuing to learn even more about how to design tutoring programs to be effective. And I'm excited to share in closing here some of the most recent findings that have potential to really greatly improve scalability and sustainability. First, our in-person tutoring is often preferred by districts for a number of reasons. However, we do have two recent studies specifically on virtual tutoring that show that virtual tutoring can also be highly effective and provides important flexibility, especially for the more rural areas, for when it's difficult to fill those in-person slots. So virtual tutoring is certainly a viable option when thinking about designing high-impact tutoring for your district. We also released a paper recently where we studied opt-in or on-demand tutoring programs where the tutors were available for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, but the students had to reach out to them in order to meet with them. And what we found was that less than 20% of students reached out, and that those that did were much more likely to be high achieving. Think about those students who are already doing well, that want, they're the ones that are kind of on top of their own learning. So ultimately, opt-in or on-demand tutoring did not turn out to be equitable, and in fact, and this study in particular worked against the equity goals that we lay out in our model. Another study that we're particularly excited about shows that short bursts of targeted instruction can be highly effective for young students. And when a tutor is regularly in the classroom, it can develop positive relationships, and it may only take 5 to 7 minutes to have dramatic effects on early literacy outcomes. So, this randomized control trial was particularly exciting because we found students who participated in the program were more than twice as likely to reach the targeted benchmark by the end of the academic year. And this particular program only cost about $400 per student, so it was very cost effective and allowed for a more sustainable structure. So that's also something to think about in terms of funding is cost per pupil, and how sustainable that truly is given your district budget. Student attendance improves on days when tutoring sessions are scheduled. This is new, hot off the press out of our DC study. And so that's something that I am happy to share with you. But if you go to our website, you can certainly see more about that. And really, just kind of the takeaway here is the research tells us a lot about these elements of effective tutoring, and what we are learning so far continues to provide important practical guidance for program design. Next slide. Okay, so where do we go from here? What do we want to learn more about? We always have an ongoing research agenda at NSSA, and the questions are never ending, right, on what we want to learn. But these are some things that we're working on right now that you can expect to see in the future. We want to determine characteristics of and conditions under which relationship-based high-impact tutoring is most efficacious. So thinking about how this would look in a virtual model with a very scripted curriculum, or AI tutoring, for instance. We also are working to identify ways to diversify and increase tutor supply for the long term, given that we know that tight labor markets and capacity will continue to be a challenge. So a lot of our district partners are starting to identify ways to diversify their tutor supply for the long term, like engaging in local partnerships or with community-based organizations or higher ed institutions. But we've also been engaged with states that are leveraging things like federal work study and teacher prep programs to really help take their tutoring to scale. We're looking at partial implementation and program effectiveness based on kind of like, if you think of like a threshold of how much needs to be implemented in order for it to be effective. We're looking at tutor reflections, so stigma around tutoring and those effects on uptake and sustainability, so that messaging around tutoring. Long-term treatment benefit effects, so thinking about student outcome, academic outcomes as well as life outcomes long term. And then AI and tutoring. This is a very hot topic that we are eager to learn more about. We recently just started our generative AI hub in education, and I'm very excited of what's coming out, what's coming out with that when we launch this fall. But right now we're doing a study that looks at an AI tutor and an AI tutor plus a human tutor. So hopefully we'll have some indication of what that looks like in the next year. But with that being said, our theory of action at NSSA is that one thing that makes high impact tutoring so effective is the relationship piece. So AI can help with the personalization of instruction, but our hypothesis is that there needs to be a human involved to really make it as effective as it can be. And the next slide is just a snapshot of our current district partners. So you can just kind of get a sense of what who we've been learning from through various studies and communities of practice to really inform sustainable tutoring models as we work towards reimagining education for long-term success. And the last slide, I just put the link to our website. There's a variety of supportive materials that can be helpful. Watch this space. This is where we continue to publish our work that we learn. And I know that I'm a bit over time, so thank you so much for the opportunity for sharing today. And with that, I'll turn it back to Colby, who will be facilitating next.
Thanks, Leah. We had a question about the research studies you were referencing. Are they all located on your website, the NSSA website here as well?
Correct. So if you go to that link to that studentsportaccelerator.org, we have a research tab. And if you go to the research tab, you will see briefs or reports. So there are some one pagers, but the reporting out is a bit more extensive. So you might see a 15-page research report. If you have specific questions about those studies, feel free to reach out to me, and I'd be happy to talk to you about those individual studies a little bit in more detail. But that was where you can find all of the recent research that I mentioned in this webinar.
Yes, and I get the updated reports and things that come out, and they come out throughout the year. So as y'all complete those and get those out, very informative, very comprehensive, as you mentioned. So there's lots of different resources and takeaways that you can take depending on what your needs are with that as well. So Leah, I do want to thank you for your time and coming to present the most updated research and information. Your tools, the tools the NSSA have provided are definitely great for any high impact tutoring program, and will continue to be a great source of information. And good to see all the partnerships you have in Texas as y'all continue to do the research. Also, just a plug, if you missed our webinar last week, we did an outcomes-based contracting. We did have Ector County come and talk about their journey with outcomes-based contracting. That video and deck will be posted on the same website, our accelerated instruction webpage, where we'll post this deck and video shortly. Should be posted later this week. So do want to thank you all for joining us today. And again, thank you for joining us. It's been a pleasure, and I hope y'all have a great day. Bye-bye.